Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Wherever you may be, I'm One Man Tea Party, and this is a retrospective on Crash Bandicoot. Spinning, sliding, and dancing his way through the various games that have come and gone, the future looks grim for the trouser-wearing rat, with its current slave masters, Activision, having relegated the geniuses at Toys for Bob, Vicarious Visions, and Beanox to venture down into the minds of Call of Duty and Diablo, serving only to better line the pockets of the Dark Lord himself. But that's all an aside. As sad as the current state of Crash is, the trend looking towards the pretty but somewhat bland Temperon ripoffs, I'd like to take a look at a time before then. A time when giants walked this earth, and they just happened to make games. This is a Crash Bandicoot retrospective. Spin to win. The year was 1994. Naughty Dog, a small studio created by Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, had just made a gigantic deal with Universal Interactive to publish their 3DO fighting game, Where the Warrior. The game was developed mostly out of pocket by the two young studio heads, along with a few friends helping with various elements of the process, including making their neighbors think they were filming a porno. Mark Cerny, the prime gamer himself who had a storied career at Sega, having lived in Japan and came back to America to found the Sega Technical Institute, despite his young age, had moved on to Universal Interactive, where he was searching for new talent. And new talent he found in the young Andy and Jason. The two childhood friends had been making games since 1983, and despite having a few small hits to their name, most notably being the Sega Genesis RPG Rings of Power, they'd never hit the big leagues before this moment. Rings of Power was published by Electronic Arts, and it sold out almost immediately, which you'd assume would mean they'd print more, and release them to the hungry market. But no, unfortunately for Naughty Dog, a certain series of American hand-art games named after notable aerophobic John Madden had released around the same time and was selling just as well. Sega only allowed so many game cards to be printed by a publisher every year, and as Rings of Power required a more expensive type of chip to create, lost out in favor of the Madden games. Pissed off and feeling like they were screwed over, development of Rings of Power taking years and difficult due to the two being in different parts of the country for most of the development, they decided to both quit the industry. Andy, a programming genius, moved on to get his PhD at MIT and begun working on AI. Jason, who was more of a creative type, moved to California, learned to surf, and started to work in the special effects industry. Just as Jason was about to accept a contract for the 1994 movie Wolf starring Jack Nicholson, Trip Hawkins of EA fame axed his way through the door, apologized for the treatment they got last time, and offered them a chance to develop a game for the 3DO, which he was in charge of.
It plugs into the future.
The two got a second wind, and Jason moved up to Boston to start to work on Where the Warrior with Andy. Where the Warrior was released in November 1994 to middling reception. The game was clearly a Mortal Kombat clone, and most of all was painful to play. This was a consequence of the 3DO's controller being badly designed, which made simple inputs like a Shoryuken command dislodge the back of the controller. Despite the issues, Universal and particularly Mark Cerny were excited to see what the studio would do next, having published the Dog's game. Being asked this, they simply said they'd like to hire some employees and have $2 million to develop a new game. Surprisingly enough, Universal accepted and gave them an office on the Universal Studios backlot. Andy and Jason then hired their first employee, a friend of Andy's from MIT, Dave Baguette, and then began their long drive from Boston to California. And of course we can't forget Jason's dog Morgan, who is the namesake of the company. She took the long drive down with them as well, keeping them company while the two discussed their next game. They wanted to do something in 3D. The industry was heading that way and they dabbled in it, but never completely. Rings of Power was isometric, which gave the illusion of 3D from the top down, and Where the Warrior was 2D, with the sprites being photographs of real people, giving it a different look. Some genres have made the jump to 3D with varying success, most notably racing games. Sega Rally had come out that year and was an awesome transition into the new dimension. They also discussed Virtua Fighter, Sega's fighting game that had made the jump as well. Both Sega games and both successful enough in their own rights. There was one notable omission though, being Sega's premier series, Sonic the Hedgehog. He hadn't made the transition yet. Sonic 3D Blast was still a few years out, and that was isometric. Platformers, they thought. Platforms were something that hadn't been challenged yet. So they got talking. Character action games were all the rage during the 80s and 90s. Mario and Sonic and countless others had found success. They were all 2D though. Donkey Kong Country had come out that year for the Super Nintendo, utilizing a similar technology to what they'd used in Where the Warrior, though far more advanced. Rare had used 3D sprites to great effect, giving the game a unique look and shattering the expectations of what could be done in the genre. It wasn't true 3D though, they knew. It would be difficult to do. The phrase that stuck was Sonic's ass. Don't Google that, kids. In making a platform would be played from behind, and without making the player dizzy from crazy camera angles, the view would be stuck firmly on the character's back. You'd stare at that blue blur's rectum the whole time and wouldn't get that signature look of the character. And they wanted to make a character, no, a mascot. See, they already had an idea of what they wanted to make the game on. Nintendo had Mario, and it was somewhat known they were working on their own 3D Mario game and 3D capable system. Sega obviously had Sonic, but with the Genesis's 3D capabilities being on the weaker side and the slow demise of the company being visible from a mile away, Andy and Jason had decided on Sony. Sony's PlayStation hadn't been released yet, though it was looking promising. 32 bits, CDs, and no mascot, meaning no competition on the console itself. It was almost ideal. So, ruminated some more and arrived in Los Angeles, moving into their fresh new office on the Universal backlot, right next door to another fledgling studio, Extreme Software. They began to work on gaming history. Now, let's stop here for just a second. I'd like to take a small break here, refill this mug with some fresh tea, and talk about the creator. No, nothing too deep, just hear me out. Since Crash has come and gone and made its mark on the gaming landscape, there have been many claims as to who actually created the game. Andy and Jason, being the heads of the studio and the original source of talent for the company, would probably be the first thought to your mind. They themselves say that the whole process of creating the game could be credited to over 100 people, though there is some dispute in it, and the people who lay their claim to fame for creating the mad marsupial. David Siller, who was the creator of the Sunsoft series Era the Acro-Bat on the Sega Genesis, had left that company to work at Universal Interactive, serving as a producer for Crash Bandicoot. Arrow itself was a character action game, being well received, and also then having a sequel and spin-off before David's departure. David got fired from Universal a short while into the making of Crash 2, according to Rob Titus, who joined Naughty Dog during the sequel's development, and not many people actually have much to say about what he did on the games. Saying that, he has since released various design documents from the game, presumably being real, which are a nice source of information for the earlier concepts of Crash. David, and a couple of artists we'll be talking about shortly, claim that he was the primary designer of the game, citing the documents as proof of his overriding genius. However, Andy and Jason both cite these as David having just drawn cute little summaries of the day's work to show the progress, rather than him having come up with it himself. Similarly, those two artists, Joe Pearson and Charles Zimbalas, both professional animators, have made some claim to it as well, backing up David's angle on it. They both came up with different ideas for the design of Crash, with one of Joe's designs being similar to what we know, only with Crash wearing a black mask being what was used as a template. All three of these men have been rather vocal about how they feel like they didn't get enough credit for the game, with particular resentment being laid at Andy and Jason, with claims of them not being credited enough or overplaying their own roles in the creation of the game. In one example, David accused Jason of threatening his life, which at least one other person has some knowledge of. Overall, it seems like David's time at Universal was filled with some level of conflict between Andy, Jason, and himself, and there's a reason he'd feel bitter if he felt wronged. In Andy and Jason's own retrospectives and in interviews since, they've both accredited the work of the artist significantly enough, I'd say. In particular, Joe and Charles have both said that Jason has made quite the effort to credit them since, as he felt bad at the time that they at Naughty Dog hadn't been so free in crediting them. This continued into Jack and Daxter with Charles, who would still work with the dogs despite the issues. He was credited as additional character designer for the game, which he wasn't too happy about again. Charles does say that in spite of it all, he loved working with Naughty Dog. It does beg the question of who would be titled as the creator of the game. However, I think there's one easy answer to it. As a game is made up of many different parts, it's difficult to actually attribute one sole person or persons to the title of the creator. I'd reckon that it's better to look at it as the sum of its parts. Parts it has in spades. The creator of the game is surely Naughty Dog, and Universal, and everyone else who contributed to it, as the process is an iterative one, built off the backs of many people. One more note on David though. Since leaving Naughty Dog, his career hasn't been the most exciting. He directed a Ghosts and Goblins spin-off for the PS2, Maximo, Ghost to Glory, which is actually a pretty good game. Apart from that, he was working on a freaky Mario parody which never took off. If I have to suffer through it, you have to suffer through it too.
Belly bonk to stun gremlins!
Strange guy. And with that out of the way and my cup refilled, let's go over the game itself and those parts that it's made up of. Not to overplay the hands of them, but I'd say that Andy and Jason are kinda geniuses. Not in some grandiose sense of putting them on a pedestal, but they did some things that no one else should have been able to do. And before I talk about this, I'd like to make it clear that I have no idea what any of the technobabble means in any great detail, only at a surface level. This made it extremely difficult to pass most of what Andy talks about in interviews or on his blog, as I'm just a nutbrain doofus who has to try and translate the talk into small words that make sense to me and any of the other tech illiterate out there. Andy, during his time at MIT, fell in love with Lisp, a family of programming languages. When making Crash, he decided that in order to create something that hadn't been done before, he'd have to create a tool that didn't exist. So he created a programming language with Lisp, along with a ramshackle tool that could put levels together. Then he, Dave Baguette, and Mark Cerny started programming. Jason, being more artistically minded, was the primary animator in the game. Although he put his hand to developing 1 or 2 levels, he mostly stuck to animating Crash. With Crash, Jason said the secret to its success was its art, and the secret to its art was its programming. Andy, Dave, and Mark Cerny all dove head in, while Naughty Dog hired some more employees. Taylor Kurosaki, a visual effects artist who liked the look of what they were doing, hit it off with Andy and Jason and joined them as an artist, modeling things for the game. Similarly, another artist, Bob Raffay, joined them because he liked the garage band feel of the company and the camaraderie. Charlotte Francis worked as a texture artist and the only female employee of Naughty Dog at the time, like in the young work environment. Justin Monast as well got headhunted by Mark Cerny to work on IT. Finally, Dan Colmorgan became the sound engineer after a planned port of Way of the Warrior for the PlayStation was cancelled. This kick-ass team of Naughty Dogs all got dragged into the bliss of making the game. One important thing to note, however, is that although people had their roles in the making of the game, they contributed wherever they were needed, making levels, game testing and such. Working on the new hardware being the PlayStation proved difficult. Although there were technical guidelines they were meant to follow, the console was new and unreleased. Andy was dissatisfied with it and did what he did best: code. Managing to essentially hack the console and utilize powers that shouldn't have been capable of reaching. As a CD-based system, the PlayStation would have to read the disc, which would happen upon its spinning and loading information, which Crash would do too many times. It spun around 120 to 140,000 times while playing, which was about 60,000 times more than it should spin over the PlayStation's entire life cycle. The man from Sony who came to check in on how it was going, the late Kelly Flock, had visited Naughty Dog after a videotape had been sent to Sony showcasing what they were working on.
This?
Simply put, it seemed impossible. It looked too good, it shouldn't be able to run. Kelly, after hearing how many times the game needed to spin in order to run, was horrified. But he knew that what they were working on was potentially great and decided to not say anything to anyone back at Sony. On the part of technical restrictions, it's interesting to note that Crash himself only has 2 textures, one being the spot on his back and the other some shadows under his shoes. His model is primarily made up of different vertexes or polygons, his colors being shaders rather than textures. These vertexes were stored all at once at 30 frames per second, allowing them to be accessed at any time, letting Crash be animated more fluidly. This model, which was created by Jason Rubin, stood leagues above almost every other model at the time. In Mario 64, released the same year as Crash for the Nintendo 64, do I really need to explain that? Had Mario rendered in an ugly 3D, Andy's sentiments, and blurred textured backgrounds. It was a technical masterpiece of movement and gameplay and a completely different style to Crash's, though Crash still managed to look far better than the Plumber despite the N64's superior hardware, at least in my opinion. Crash's beautiful environments, however, worked on by Bob Raffay, Joe Pearson and Charles Zimbalist, is still super impressive today, though in a completely different way. Jungles, ruins, laboratories and castles all made up the different places Crash had to venture through. The level started off too big though, the first barely being able to be loaded on the level editor. So although they were still large by the release of the game, they needed some adjustments in order to even function. Most of this was achieved by hiding the polygons and vertexes behind foliage, loading in when needed. This was revolutionary at the time and allowed them to fit gigantic 12MB levels into the 2MB of RAM that the PlayStation had. Andy, Dave, and most of all Mark were able to compress them by adjusting the levels as such. Enemies would line the paths, 2 or 3 at a time due to technical limitations, and give Crash a bit more of a challenge as he'd run and jump along the levels, taking on a third-person view in which Crash was able to move freely around in a corridor. This took away from the Sonic's arse problem as you were able to turn around and see Crash's face at any time. There was something missing though. The levels were beautiful, sure, and the animations were great, but they were missing that chef's kiss, that ultra finisher to make them extra spicy. They needed something low in polygons, as most of the polygons were taken up by the enemies. So they came up with a simple concept: crates. Crates were easy to place in, as they didn't require much in the way of polygon count and were easily interactable. Those little boxes turned Crash from a simple get-to-the-end platformer into a collectathon, with an extra challenge chucked in. Different crates were made: bouncy crates, checkpoint crates, extra life crates, and of course TNT crates. Collecting all of the crates in a level would earn you a crystal gem, with some levels having extra colored gems which would open up alternate routes in earlier levels to get more crystal gems. These are great fun and blindingly difficult to do at some points. At a certain point while playing the game for this video, I gave up trying to do them, as it was just taking far too much time per level and I'm really not that good at it. Collecting all these gems lets you open up a special route at the end of the game, which gives you some alternate credit showing what happens to the characters of the game. Saying that, let's talk about those characters. Crash started his life as a wombat. Naughty Dog looked through various books to settle on what sort of creature to make their mascot. They found a book about Tasmania and settled on the chubby little bear-looking animal. Butch Hartman of Fairly Odd Parents fame gave the character a terrifying look in his distinct style, but Andy and Jason wanted it to look barely like the real thing and let him go. Jason at the time had fallen in love with the Animaniacs, the satirical Warner Brothers cartoon. On the show there was a segment dedicated to two rats called Pinky and the Brain. One's a genius and the other's insane. The characters had a combination of untethered insanity, mixed with dry intelligent wit from the titular rats. They had gotten their genius by being experimented on, and all of a sudden Naughty Dog had some ideas for their main characters. Crash, or Willy Wombat at the time, would be an off-the-wall insane animal, having been experimented on by the evil genius Dr. Neo Cortex. Cortex, being decided upon at a delicious Italian lunch, was Andy's brainchild, who they settled on being a self-assured supervillain who would brainwash Willy, among other Tasmanian creatures, with pop culture references. See, Crash was originally going to speak, spitting out pop culture-based lines like nobody's business. There was just one issue though. It was obnoxious. The Gex series had prided itself on making a character just like that and making references to other things. But those references were either too cheesy or date themselves badly.
Ah, Detroit, Pearl of the Orient!
Consequently, that Willy was left outside in the rain, and they settled on a silent protagonist instead. Crash, Cortex, and the other characters were then designed by the incredibly talented Joe Pearson and Charles Zimbalas, who succumbed to Andy and Jason's rabid requests for changes. The result was a cast of insane animals and humans, which also gives me a chance to talk about them in their boss fights. Papu Papu, Ripperoo, Koala Kong, Pinstripe, Embryo, and Cortex serve as the bosses of the game, each with their own mechanics. Papu Papu spins a stick which you avoid to jump on his head. Ripperoo jumps around his arena while oversized TNT flow down the waterfall waiting to be blown up. Koala Kong is Donkey Kong, but he's a koala. Seriously, he chucks boulders at you and you spin them back. There's not much to do there. Pinstripe Potteroo is a smooth-talking criminal, firing a Tommy gun while you avoid it. And Embryo the Potions Master throws slimes at you before taking a cheeky nightcap and going Hulk on Crash. Cortex is the final boss of the game, is a bit of a letdown. He's a great villain, but the actual boss fight is a bit boring. He flies around on a floating hoverboard, but you just dodge lasers and wait for the green ones to appear to hit back at him. After hitting enough at him, you end the adventure. None of the boss fights are particularly great outside of Ripperoo and Embryo, who mostly coast by and having a little more to think about. Ripperoo's bouncing gets more erratic later on in the fight, and Embryo has a couple of different phases. The others kind of fizzle out like wet farts, though graphically they're all wonderful. I particularly love Pinstripe's office being a mafia den, the levels leading up to it being sewers with various henchmen throwing barrels of toxic ooze at you. And here's a fact, Pinstripe was originally the Bandicoot before the particular role was stolen by the big boy himself. Pinstripe became a Potteroo after that. Also part of the cast is Torna, Crash's girlfriend. She's a buxom Bandicoot who gets kidnapped at the start of the game, serving no real other purpose other than being rescued. There's some bonus levels which you enter by collecting 3 emblems with a face plastered on them, serving as an extra challenge. Brio and Cortex have some as well. These are played in 2.5D. They're more traditional platforming segments, with some of them being ridiculously tight in difficulty. Torna didn't make it past Crash 1 outside of a few references, being a little too sexual for the family-friendly franchise, which Andy and Jason both relented on. Coco Bandicoot, Crash's sister, replaced her in the sequels, serving as support rather than eye candy. Aku Aku, the magical mask, guides Crash on his journey and serves as a power-up. When you smash an Aku Aku box, you hear the wonderful sounds Ooga Booga, voiced by David Siller. While the mask is floating around Crash, he serves as a bit of extra health, allowing you to be hit by additional enemies and stage hazards. He can be upgraded twice, with the first upgrade turning him gold and allowing you to take 2 hits before he disappears. The second upgrade gives you invincibility, akin to Mario collecting a star. This places some tribal music and allows you to simply walk through the level, the only death being possible from plummeting into pits or other offstage death traps. From the outset, Andy and Jason wanted a game that could be accessible to everyone. Nowadays, the game has a reputation for its blindingly hard difficulty. The Dark Souls of Crash games, as it were, but I'd mainly boil that down to some slightly slippery controls. Some of the platforming is tight, sure, but there are plenty harder platformers out there, and I think the difficulty is unfortunately overblown, which might scare away new players, which is not what Naughty Dog intended. There aren't many moments that are difficult that I wouldn't attribute to the controls or something bugging out a little bit. Hitboxes can be a little inconsistent, and sometimes the amount of times you can spin in a row feels in the favor of the game, leading to deaths. The levels themselves are generally joys to play through though, so it can be forgiven if it's frustrating at times. Design-wise, there are 2 levels that stand out. On the last of the islands, Lights Out and the Lab are both super excellent. The first utilizes Aku-Aku power-ups all over the level to act as a torch, lighting up the level while he remains active, though temporarily. As it's not a real Aku-Aku, it's a grey one. It's frantic and you need to run through the levels at speed to get through safely, which makes everything a lot more precise. The lab is kind of the opposite. Being slow and methodical, you have to open doors with switches and wait for enemies to stop attacking and dash in and out to clear the path before moving on, jumping over trapdoors near electricity. These are my favourite levels in the game and stand out as some of my favourite in the franchise, though for simple reasons. The music also manages to hit a similar sweet spot that the rest of the game does, though it might not have been that way if Naughty Dog hadn't intervened. The Dogs didn't have much time before the game was going to be shown at E3, and had asked David Siller to organise a musician, as was his role as producer. He came back with Mark Mothersbaugh, lead singer of Devo and later founder of a production company, Mutata Musica, which created music for different media, games included. Siller pitched the music as being an urban chaotic symphony, being made up of different random sound effects from the real world, like bird chirps and farts. Mothersbaugh and Josh Mansell, who worked at Mutata Musica at the time, then began working on Naughty Dog Envisioned, which was something more melodic, that wouldn't interfere with the levels, but work in tandem. Dave Baggett lended his ear as well, and Josh Mansell and Dave worked together, more hands-on than Mark, who oversaw it. I think the result is fantastic. Muted enough that they don't detract from the game, but catchy enough that I still find myself humming a lot of them. Hog Wild and Whole Hog level themes in particular stand out. If it makes any sense, the levels are completely linear as opposed to the rest of the levels, in that they take the same amount of time no matter how fast you complete them, because you can't go any faster on the Hog. The tracks along with the voice lines had to be compressed, as was the norm for basically everything on the process, which means that the MIDI samples would sound much lower quality than was originally recorded, and while the soundtrack is fantastic, the jungle tracks work a lot better, given that they also had atmospheric sounds in them, along with the music. Some of the music had to be rewritten when it came to look at the Japanese version, but we'll talk about that a bit later, since that whole localization process was meaty. This comes back around nicely on what outside forces thought of the game. Ken Kutaragi, the father of the PlayStation, famously took Mark Cerny to one side at E3 where Crash was being displayed in the Sony booth. Kutaragi-san wanted high-definition graphics and had a dream of game graphics looking true to life, like a Hollywood movie. He called Crash ugly, and it would never sell. Also at the expo was Shigeru Miyamoto, Mario's creator. Nintendo was advertising Mario 64, and Miyamoto was looking around. He spotted the Crash booth and gave it a try, with Andy and Jason standing behind him crapping their pants. His reactions were only rumor, but he apparently didn't have much to say. He liked the running water in some of the levels, preferring it to how they'd done it in Mario with flat textures and bubble sprites underneath. But other than that, radio silence. This lukewarm attitude to Crash during development kind of pervaded the whole process of it. Although Sony USA had some slight resistance to Crash initially, mostly on the technical end and fear it would destroy the console come release, they were on board with their unofficial mascot. Sony Japan, however, had some different ideas. Shuhei Yoshida also worked as a producer on Crash on the Sony end, along with his assistant Shimizu. They knew the Japanese market, and Shuhei gave suggestions when needed on how to adapt the game for Eastern sensibilities. Despite the cooperation on Yoshida's end, Sony Japan didn't particularly care for Crash at first. Naughty Dog met with some Sony Japan executives who handed them a document. This document showed Crash and compared it with other games. Japanese games. Mario and Knights to be specific. Knights was Sega's attempt at a new 3D mascot who melded 2.5D with 3D models to give the illusion of real 3D. The document rated Crash highly in graphics, though 2 categories stood out, being Crash's weaknesses. The first being they just plain didn't like the character. They didn't jive with it like the USA did. Secondly was a column titled Heritage, with Mario and Knights being Japanese and Crash as other. Japan had a stranglehold on the video games industry during the 90s, with Nintendo having revitalized the industry with the NES the decade prior. Games from the US didn't have the same cultural heritage to the Japanese that ones made within the home country did. Mark Cerny was also in the meeting though, and held a lot of respect with the Japanese executives, as he'd worked on Sonic 2, spoke Japanese and had a history with working with Sega, a Japanese company. From the look on his face, Andy knew that it wasn't good. The Japanese thought that Crash looked too aggressive, so during a meeting, Andy, Jason, and Mark ran out to see Charlotte, who had spent the past 2 days solidly working on renderings for the meeting, and asked her to close Crash's mouth, change his eyes to black Pac-Man, and make his spikes smaller. 15 minutes later, they dashed back in and presented it. It worked. From then on, there were 2 Crashes, the original Crash and Japanese Crash. There was a concerted effort into making Crash marketable in Japan, as would be the other primary market outside of the English-speaking world. So there was a different marketing team for it. Crash's dance animation, which was just a placeholder animation Jason had made, was turned into the official dance in the Japanese adverts, with the Crash Bandicoot song blaring at all angles. Overall, the marketing in Japan was done as if it was a Japanese game. Andy had said that this was the same in pretty much all of the territories, with adverts being locally produced closer to home rather than America. This probably helped in Crash's international appeal, as it was being advertised as a product of the world, rather than just as another American game. In Localization 2, Crash got polished for different territories. This wasn't unique, as other games had their gameplay and features adjusted for different sensibilities. Mega Man 2, for instance, had a massive decline in difficulty when it came over from Japan. In Crash's case, the Japanese version had some significant changes, which Andy and Dave Baguette both dove straight into after the American version had been finished. The game was made slightly easier, often by adding extra continue points, and whenever new mechanics or gameplay styles would appear, Aku would stop the player and explain in a text box how it all worked. The main menu wasn't just an easy translation, as the logo was in Japanese and required a new model to be painstakingly created, although fitting in the hiragana and katakana characters required some more stretching of the available data in the game. The game wouldn't have been able to fit kanji, which wasn't all that rare during that era, with games like Pokemon only using the writing system within the last decade. Other cultural changes were put in too, with things like crates flying in Crash's head at the end showing how many he collected being removed or slightly changed, as apparently Japanese children found it too disturbing. Another similar change was made to one of Crash's death animations, in which he blows up and all that's left are his eyeballs and shoes. There happened to be a serial killer who murdered children and left their shoes outside of a school, which obviously meant that Crash's death was hitting a little too close to home in that case. Some of the music was changed as well, with 5 tracks being changed to be more video gamey. These were the Torna bonus levels, along with 4 of the boss battle songs. Changes needed to happen in Europe as well, although not even close to as many as the Japanese version. Andy was in charge of localizing, or at least the programming end of it, allowing multiple languages to be selected in the back end. This is something he was proud of, and which Naughty Dog kept adding onto future game releases, with multiple languages being easily accessible, far from the norm at the time, probably because of the complications in programming it all. In the European PAL releases, the game had to be slowed down slightly, as 50Hz was the standard for most televisions, rather than the 60Hz for America and Japan. This meant that the game ran 16% slower than the original release, and also had a slightly different resolution, which could have caused problems. The game rested a lot of its laurels on being well animated, which could be jeopardized by having the frames run slower, along with a slightly different resolution. Andy solved this by making the models be able to move independent of their frames, which was also accounted for in the US version. This allowed the transition to be smooth and make Crash still look fantastic in its otherwise inferior state. Saying that, opposite of the Japanese release, the European release was made slightly more difficult, with TNTs exploding faster, though Ripperoo jumped slower. Despite any differences, big and small, it was clear that Crash was a hit. The advertising campaign was half absurd and half straight out of the Attitude area of marketing. A man in a Crash suit went to Nintendo's headquarters, blasting in a megaphone that their end was near. There was a new kid crashing in on the scene, and he was some marsupial that no one had ever heard of. Crash Bandicoot came out in America on September 9th, 1996, and from then on it started selling. Kept selling, in fact, far outpacing what they expected. 1 million, 2 million, it just kept going. By the end of the PlayStation's life cycle, it had sold 6.8 million copies worldwide. Although it obviously sold well, the critics' reception was mixed. The game was praised for its visuals, deservedly so. The rich background, stellar animations, and varied level design was a wonder, especially on the new PlayStation. The gameplay was the thing that was mostly criticized though. A lot of that seemed to focus on the game not being open world, and a lack of innovation in the platformer genre. Looking back at the criticisms, especially regarding the game not being open world, it's kind of funny. Even today there's great focus on games being bigger and grander in scale than before, and there's a lot of great expansive games out there. Alongside these, however, there's definitely a greater appreciation for smaller, more tightly polished games that almost have a one-track focus of what they want to do. In a more general sense though, I'd agree with the gameplay not being revolutionary, though that's different from not saying it's fun. The game is definitely fun, at least in my opinion, though the greatest part of the charm the game gives off is graphically and musically, and frankly I think the sales reflect the positive opinions of it. Naughty Dog had finally made their hit, Andy and Jason living it big. After a ceremonious release and press tour, there came the question that always seemed to linger whenever they finished something. What next? They were obviously going to do a sequel, and another one after that, and a racing game after that, though none of these are quite so important right here, right now. As great as they were, better certainly, more refined, the sequel games are iterations on what they'd done. Crash Bandicoot 2, The Wrath of Cortex was bigger, better looking, had a realish story, and evolved the series even more. Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped did the same, trying to be an end to the main series at the time. After that was Crash Team Racing, which in my opinion is one of the greatest kart racer games ever made, and was meant to be a complete end to the series at that point. They were working on something new and original again. Andy didn't even really have much to do with Crash Team Racing during its development, as he was working on evolving gaming again with Jak and Daxter, being one of the first completely open-world platformers having no loading screens whatsoever. What matters right here and now is that Crash existed like the big gaseous star it was, hip thrusting his way to success. Andy and Jason were young and rebellious, kind of like Crash in a much less insane way. They refused to back down when other forces tried to stem the creative process because they knew what they wanted to do, at least at a macro level. I think it'd be irresponsible to say they were perfect through and through though. During production, Jason was apparently like a mad dog, constantly in a state of loathing about what they were making, even if he knew it was functionally great. Similarly, Mark said he didn't enjoy the gameplay by the end of development, though by all accounts he's a much more even-keeled guy. Andy and Jason would often get into screaming matches like an old married couple, in which Andy would often claim that something Jason was demanding was impossible only to turn it around and deliver what was asked relatively quickly. You know, that old Kirk and Bones trick. The stress of 100-hour work weeks wore everyone down, which added to the stress, though the team don't regret that time. They were young and were driven, wanting to achieve releasing the game. Industry crunch is a topic that's been far more prevalent lately, particularly in regards to modern Naughty Dog, with The Last of Us 2 notably having excessive crunching hours wearing developers down. Dan Colmorgan was fired shortly after they finished Crash, which he looked back at bitterly, saying that he thought they may have wanted someone more experienced. Dan had just graduated from college a short while before joining Naughty Dog. Similarly, Dave Baggett left Naughty Dog at the end of Crash 2, citing that Andy and Jason's close working relationship made it hard to slide in and jive with them on the same level. Although he did still work on the music of Crash 3 and Crash Team Racing, remaining friends with all of the Naughty Dogs. Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin both left Naughty Dog in 2004, after the third game in the Jak and Daxter series, Jak 3, released. They both worked on a video mashup website, Flector, which was sold to Fox Interactive Media, then shut down in 2009. Andy's written a few dark fantasy novels and spends a lot of his days writing about the restaurants he's visited on his blog, All Things Andy Gavin. Jason moved on to THQ to become its president in 2012 before the company's demise, before moving to work at Oculus, being head of the first-party content initiative. They've both appeared in numerous interviews and panels, all of which have been extremely helpful for researching this video. Throughout all these retrospective looks, they look back fondly on Crash despite the issues that came up while working on it. All the dramas and work that came from creating something that still look back at today, especially with the Nitro trilogy remaking them. It's sad to know the franchise probably won't be on the same pace that it was being. But I digress. The current state of Crash is part of a greater discussion about Activision Blizzard as a whole, with the focus being channeled into where it's most profitable rather than finding that fine line between profit and great games. What we can hope for in the future is that Crash and his many friends down in the COD slag mines get a chance to come back out again one day, and show us that fun is still out there. Now, I've finished my tea, and I think that's all for today. I've been One Man Tea Party. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.